for me, life is about whether or not I can control what I do with my life and whether I can set my own agenda. You know, my life is finite, and you know, the thought that somebody else was telling me what I can and normally what I can't do isn't something that would really work for me. So yeah, it is a passion, both professionally, but it's how I think most of us would choose to live our lives, isn't it? Most, if you like, non-disabled people don't really have to have somebody else saying you can and you can't do that. Once you're an adult, within limits, you can do what you like. Obviously, if it's illegal, you may face the consequences, but in a different presentation, I always say that every one of us probably breaks law every single day of our lives. You know, I didn't drive here today, but if I did drive here, chances are I'd have gone over 70 at some stage because I'm always late. You know, so we make those decisions every day, don't we? And it's kind of the way it is. But, you know, very often for disabled people, you know, their choices about what they can do and more normally what they can't do is constrained by somebody else who thinks they know best. And maybe they do, maybe they don't. I was talking a little bit today about how, you know, the subject of a user-led organisation is dear to my heart, but as we've kind of discovered already today, the term has got more problems and it probably has solutions. You know, the whole context, the whole intellectual debate about a user is really quite difficult, I think. You know, it's a term that doesn't fit very well with lots of people. So I thought I'd just, in a way, talk about what I perceive with Spectrum and my, you know, time around, just about, you know, what it's all about when it comes down to it, and then towards the end maybe we'll talk about the design criteria and how we've tried to make sense of those things. And please tell me if I'm going too long, won't you, Andrew, because I haven't got a clock I can see, and so somebody else tell me if I'm running long. So Spectrum Centre for Independent Living was formed in the 80s. So we were formed at a time when most disabled people either lived with their parents until they couldn't look after them anymore, or they just went into institutions of one shape or another. Spectrum came into being simply because there were a number of disabled people who were in residential care institutions who decided that they didn't want to be, you know, confined to a third-rate hotel for the rest of their lives. They wanted to live on their own, they wanted to have families, they wanted to be with their families, and they wanted to work and do what everyone else does with their lives. And so they formed Spectrum as a peer support organisation, you know, one person helping another more often than not, helping them to figure out, you know, how to get over the various barriers that were stopping them doing what they wanted to do with their lives, whether that was at the very early days, you know, the institution pays a ton of money to look after that person every week. How do we grab hold of that money so that we can live in our own home, employ our own people to do the things that we need doing? You know, those barriers were really very difficult to overcome, but they were overcome. And it gives me solace today, really, because when I think about, you know, there are a lot of barriers and difficulty and resource funding issues today, but actually they're all trivial when you compare to the barriers that those people had to overcome. It is in my lifetime, but it was a little bit before my time on the scene. And so we formed as an organisation that was there to help our peers to get a lifestyle that worked for them. And we were formed as an organisation to speak for ourselves. We were fed up, and I still think it's largely relevant today. We were fed up with organisations speaking for us who had no idea about what our lives were about. You know, big charities that, you know, where you'd hardly ever see a disabled person actually working there. And things have changed, but actually, if you look under the skin, they haven't changed as much as you think they may have done. And so we set up, we're a membership-based organisation. Our members consist of disabled people and non-disabled people, but it's only disabled people that get to vote on what happens with the organisation. We use advisors in other roles, but they don't make decisions. They don't have voting powers. The members elect a management committee who are there to govern the organisation and do the stuff that management committees do. And the management committee employs me as their principal officer, paid member of staff, and we work together to decide who else needs employing and what jobs they should be doing. And that, for me, that means that disabled people, and that's a term I'll use today, and I include, when I talk about disabled people, I just mean anybody, no matter what their impairments may be. That means that disabled people are making all of the principal decisions about the organisation, so they're deciding what the organisation is actually there to do, what's our aims. They're deciding who's going to be on the committee that makes all of the big decisions. They're deciding who they employ, because ultimately, it's staff who will be there 35, 37 hours a week that realistically are going to make a lot of the decisions, compared to a management committee that maybe meets 3 hours every 2 or 3 months. It's a morning's work, isn't it? So they make the decisions, and they make sure that all of the work that we do within the centre leads by example. So it is about all of our decisions made by disabled people. All of the people who deliver peer support services have to be disabled people themselves, and that's a really important part of what we do. And when we look at other organisations or others that are youth-led organisations, sometimes you see those factors, sometimes you don't. And I think, when you're talking about what barriers limit user-led practice, then I think very often it's about lack of clarity about what the organisation is set up to do and who its principal stakeholders are. So who are the people that this organisation belongs to? Who does it act on the behalf of? Very often those when you find barriers in organisations that are user-led, it's normally because those issues just haven't been clarified, or the agenda has moved on and somebody else is now in control and making the decisions. And to be honest, I think the most important thing in any organisation, let alone a user-led organisation, is about having a clear set of aims and something that people can feel passionately and strongly about, something that grabs people and think, yeah, this is something that I really want to devote a large part of my existence to helping to improve, and giving people a sense of belonging all too often. And I think this is particularly a factor for disabled people. They don't feel they belong anywhere, somebody else makes the decisions, they're just a kind of bit part in their own lives, really. For me, it's about giving people a sense of belonging, a sense of something that they actually own, and a sense of something that they can actually dictate the agenda of what it chooses to do. And I think those are the most important parts about what makes any organisation, let alone a user organisation, successful. There clearly are lots of barriers out there that will limit how organisations and user-led organisations can work, and some of those are resource-led, about money. It is very difficult, as you said earlier on, to get the money nowadays to do the things we want to do. But sometimes money can be a barrier as well, I think. Sometimes we constrain ourselves to think, how can we do this, as in we've only got 50 quid rather than 100 quid. You actually don't think, what can we do this for nothing? Is there a way of doing this without it actually needing to cost money? And I guess that's my job. That's the horrible part of my nature, where I have to decide, can we make do with less than we had last year? Because that's the way it is. And when I look, as I do, at what the barriers are that limit the practice of being user-led, then it's normally because actually, when you look into it, the users aren't leading that enterprise at all. It's somebody else, often commissioners, often somebody else, but it's not often the users. And I think when you have troubles, and we work a lot with commissioners, we work a lot with councils, and we work a lot with other user-led organisations, both emerging and struggling to stay alive. It's very often the key work that we have to do is to re-establish those foundations about what its aim is, why somebody should feel so strongly about it that they give up a part of their life to work or to volunteer within that organisation, and a lack of understanding about who you are ultimately accountable to. So who am I accountable to? Is it the people who are the commissioners that fund the work that we do? Or is it the people who are our members, disabled people and non-disabled allies, who are my ultimately, when it comes down to it, which of those two groups of people would I go to and say that's where I belong? I know I can answer that question, but lots of organisations will struggle to answer that question, I think. And I think the biggest difficulty in and the biggest barrier around user-led practice is very much that, is you're just not clear about your aim, you're not clear about why somebody should feel passionately about the thing that you feel passionately about. And, you know, and we bandy terms around to suit the circumstances very often. We talk about user-led when it's no more user-led than my pen. And we talk about co-production when it's no more co-produced than my cup is, you know. We need to use the terms meaningfully, and we need to get underneath the skin of what we're actually trying to achieve, rather than using some bland euphemism to characterise what that thing is. You know, Spectrum is very clearly an organisation that's run and controlled by disabled people. That's what we are. If other people want to call us user-led, then that's fine, and we'll adapt that label when it's convenient to do so. But fundamentally, we're an organisation that's owned, managed and run by disabled people. And what we choose to do is our own affair. You may choose to fund us or not fund us based on whether you like what we're doing, but ultimately it's our members and our management committee that will decide what we do and ultimately tell me what they expect me to do. And if they don't like what I do, obviously they can fire me. Thankfully, they've never done that yet. Yeah, there's always a yeah. Just moving on, and the first exercise was something around what does being user-led mean to you. The key word for me is just one word, describes it all, and it's about power. You know, users need, if it's user-led, the power sits with the individual, in my case, a disabled person. If the power sits with somebody else, then it's, sorry folks, it's just not user-led, it's something else. It's not user-led if the power doesn't sit with the individual. And that's what it means to me. I've got the power to hire and fire the staff that I decide is, and with my committee, is useful, and that means I do have the power. The members who are part of the organisation I work for have the decision-making powers over whether they hire and fire me, and that's the way it should be. And Andrew talked about the the characteristics of what a user-led organisation should be aspiring to, and talked earlier about the Department of Health's what they called the design criteria, which was a whole series of 21 criteria that would help to decide whether an organisation was user-led or not. And I think when it came out, I think broadly they're okay. I've got a handout incidentally about these things. I think broadly they're okay, but they're hopelessly cumbersome and really quite off-putting to most people, apart from sad people like me that are excited by those sorts of things. And what we've done, and I've got a couple of handouts actually that might help clarify it, what we've tried to do is to say of those 21 criteria, so they start with things like, 75% of the management group or the board of directors should be users, and goes on to all sorts of other things as well. And what we've tried to do is to pull together a kind of almost whether it is essential for that criteria to be met from day one, or whether it's something you aspire to in the future. And we hope that helps. And I've got a different handout which refines it even further as to what we think is a practical way of trying to understand what we mean by being a user-led organisation. And when we've done all of our analysis, it's very often easier to describe what isn't a user-led organisation than what is a user-led organisation. So I was going to talk briefly about what isn't a user-led organisation. So we've come up with two forms. Again, I've got handouts of all these. Maybe somebody could hand them out. You actually could do that now if you wanted to. I'll just keep one set for myself. So I've got 1, 2, 3. There's a lot to read, so I don't expect anybody to necessarily read all this, and certainly not to read it now or even today, but it might be useful to you. but what isn't a user, so these things wouldn't, in my mind, in our mind, be considered to be a user-led organisation. So an organisation that does not meaningfully involve its users or its members in decision-making and determining its directions and activities. So if its users don't do that, it's not user-led. So, for example, a disability organisation that represents disabled people but has no disabled people involved in running it isn't user-led. Sorry, just isn't. And the second definition we have about what isn't a user-led is an organisation that simply shares a common identity or common interest rather than representing the needs or experiences related to a particular form of disadvantage or exclusion. So, for example, a disabled sports club or a cultural support club would not be a ULO because, they're just there to provide sports. They don't necessarily involve their users. They just, it's a bit like Apple, people who make iPhones and they're like, they just make iPhones and people choose whether they're going to buy them or not. If they're good, people will buy them. If they're not good, they won't buy them. It's the richest company in the world, so they obviously get most things right. In fact, they've got more money than the whole of the UK has, I seem to recall from some recent stats. It's almost an obscenity, but anyway, that's another presentation. So, a disabled sports club in its own right probably wouldn't be user-led simply because, somebody else is deciding what goes on with it. So to my mind, the whole concept of being user-led is something that we should, and the terminology, we should use very advisedly, and the ultimate thing that matters is who ultimately is in control, who makes the decisions about what the organisation does, and where does the power sit within that organisation. With Apple, the power doesn't sit with people who use those phones, it sits with somebody else, people who are clever enough to design the damn things. And that's fine and that's right, but for organisations like Spectrum, we're there to make sure that what we do is what our members, our disabled people want us to do, and hopefully we get that right. And I say that, and the more I've thought about it, I think it's important for disabled people, and I mean people with learning difficulty as well as other disabled people. I think it's important because, particularly in the context of the services that people need to live their lives, health and social care primarily, those services are not something that the individuals themselves control. They don't buy the services themselves normally. Somebody else decides what those services will be. Somebody else decides how much those services should cost, and somebody else decides to buy them. And so the reason why it's really important in the context of disabled people is because very often we are passive recipients of the services that somebody else has decided we need. And that means it's really important that we have a say in how those services are designed, how they are delivered, and how they are evaluated and valued. And that's why I think it's really important that all of the user-led organisations here today and all of those outside continue to exist, and we continue to speak loudly and hopefully passionately about why it's important for all of us to be in positions where we can influence what happens within our organisation. And I think I'll probably stop there.